Those who don't know me, I think most of you do, but for those who don't, I'm Dr. Laurel Buxbaum, the Associate Director of MRRI, and I'm also the Director of the Cognition and Action Lab. And I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Shailesh Kantak, who is my long-term friend and collaborator. And Shailesh has also been is also a institute scientist at MRRI, and we'll be sharing the work that he and I are collaborating on. And then also Dr. Cory Potts, who's a postdoctoral fellow who works with both me and Shailesh. And as many of you know who are postdocs, who've had postdoc, it's often largely due to the postdoc that the work gets done. In this case, we have Cory to thank a lot for much of what we'll be presenting today. So I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see. So we're going to be talking about understanding disparity between arm use and capacity after stroke. This is sponsored by the Albert Einstein Society and the Peer Review Committee, both of whom have provided funding support for these projects. And this is part of the Shrier Family Visiting Scholar Lecture Series, which is supported by a generous gift from Nancy and Marc Shrier. And we are truly grateful for their support and belief in our mission. This is the Planning Committee, who have no financial relationships to disclose, and here are the objectives. So after this talk, you'll hopefully be able to define limb non-use. You'll be able to describe research at MRRI that investigates the link between cognitive load and arm choice, and to describe the relationship between virtual reality and real-world measures of arm choice. And I'd also like to thank our team who helped us work on the first part of the project. I'm going to be showing you Alex Miller, our VR programmer, Wend Williamson, and Chris White, our research assistants. Thank you very much to those folks. And now let's dig into the concept of limb non-use. So limb non-use actually has been taught and thought about in terms of a learning model. And the idea here is that after an injury or stroke, there's weakness in one of the upper limb. In this case, we're talking about the upper limb in one of the arms, which makes movement more effortful. There is less movement in that arm because it's more effortful, and unsuccessful attempts at movement. And it's punishing, it hurts, it's not easy to do things, you're not successful, which leads to compensatory behavior, which is less movement in that arm and even reduced ability, sort of if you don't use it, you lose it. And that's the cycle of learn non-use. So that's been in the literature, comes from animal models, and it formed the basis for the work that we're going to talk about today. It's very poorly understood. We know that it exists in humans, but we're not sure why and in whom. And it's at the interface of sensory motor processing and cognitive affective phenomena. So, which is right where some of us at MRI like to work, and we're very interested in this interface of what are the cognitive and affective predictors of a motor, so-called motor deficit. And it's very rarely assessed in the clinic, and in part because it requires specialized training and time-consuming protocols. I'm going to show you, all of us are going to show you some of those measures that are often used when it is assessed. And we don't understand its predictors. And we believe that we need to understand the mechanisms and the biomarkers. So what is it? What are the background measures and assessments, and also the neuroanatomic substrates of this use in order to characterize people at risk for it in order to develop targeted treatments. So that's the sort of philosophical and theoretical framework for the work. As an example of how we know that non-use is a problem, there was a recent large clinical trial with 78 participants. Well, I suppose that's not large, but medium-sized clinical trial, showing that despite significant gains in capacity as measured by the Action Research Arm Test, none of the 78 patients increased their arm use in daily life as measured by accelerometry. And additional studies have reported little to no correlation between changes in arm capacity after rehab and arm use. So this is very discouraging, isn't it? That a lot of effort and time is put into rehabilitation. People look better in the clinic on the tasks that they've been trained to do, and then they go home and they continue not to use their affected arm. So one of the big questions, as I said a minute ago, is what are the factors that influence non-use so that we can predict when and in whom it will occur? And some candidate factors are sensory motor capacity as measured by, for example, the Fugl-Meyer, which is a widely used measure of sensory motor capacity, stroke severity, which is lesion volume, which we know from many, many other domains. Stroke severity, as you won't be surprised to learn, affects many functions, both motor and cognitive and linguistic. Hemisphere stroke is a strong candidate, since we know that both that left and right CVA differ in a number of respects. Left CVA having the sort of cluster of deficits, including aphasia and limb apraxia, right CVA having that cluster of deficits characterized by sort of lower arousal and attention and hemispatial neglect. And then falling out from that hemisphere of stroke question is whether limb apraxia, spatial neglect, or attentional capacity might predict non-use. So in a preliminary study that we published in 2020, we looked at these factors and tried to understand the characteristics of patients who showed non-use. This is a paper with Carolee Winstein, who some of you know has been a prominent sort of force in our field for studying and trying to understand the predictors of rehabilitation outcomes. And so in that study, what we did is we used something called the actual amount of use test, which is a modification of a task developed by Taub and colleagues in some of their studies on constraint-induced therapy. And in this task, patients perform 17 daily activities that are naturalistic. And they perform these tasks in both a spontaneous condition and a constrained condition in which their less affected arm is placed in a sling. So that's what's done in constraint-induced therapy as well. And it's filmed covertly. This is actually the first time I've ever done a covert study of this sort, where we, unbeknownst to the patients, they were being filmed, and don't worry, we had IRB approval for this, filmed doing these tasks like grabbing and pulling a chair out from under a table, opening a file folder, and scored by trained and standardized raters for what proportion of each task is done by the paretic arm versus the non-paretic arm in the free condition versus the constrained condition. So in other words, what we're interested in is, left to their own devices, how do these patients do these tasks? Which arm do they use? And versus when they have to use the affected arm, how much are they able to do? And so that's that disparity between use and capacity to use, which we've called use capacity disparity, UCD, is how the non-use score is quantified. Okay. So we also performed the background battery, which included the upper extremity Fugl-Meyer, a questionnaire called the Confidence in Arm and Hand Movement Questionnaire. And now, well, the reason we included this is that some past research has suggested, and it's a little bit of a chicken and egg issue, but that people who have less confidence in their ability to use the affected arm do so, in fact, do so. and that confidence goes above and beyond capacity. A gesture imitation task, which I've used in my lab for a long time. This is our measure of limb apraxia. And note that they perform this task with their ipsilesional unimpaired arm. And the virtual reality lateralized attention task, which we developed in my lab, which was originally developed to assess neglect, but it also has a non-lateralized total score. So what that means is we measure the disparity between how many objects people wheel themselves down a virtual path using a joystick in the virtual world. They name the objects that they see on the left and right of the path, and we compare how many they name on the right and left. And that disparity is a measure of neglect. But also we sum both of those sides and get a measure of how many things do they detect and name overall. And that's a measure of sort of non-lateralized, generalized sort of attention. And it's been, we've shown problems with both of these, by the way, in right hemisphere stroke. Well, one of the most important findings of the study, and I'm going to walk you through this graph here, is that although there was a relationship between upper extremity Fugl-Meyer plotted on this x-axis here, and non-use, again, a disparity score between can do versus do on this axis, there was also some interesting breakdowns in this relationship. So one of the things that you should really look at here is a quadrant in which people have quite mild sensory motor, moderate to mild. So that's highest you can get is 66 on this scale. And nevertheless, many of these patients are showing quite a great disparity between what they do when left to their own devices versus when constrained. So non-use doesn't always follow along with low capacity. So people with good capacity are still not using their arms. So this is the non-use phenomenon. Now, what predicts this? Well, we looked at the subset of patients who were the moderate to mild subjects. So all of the people on that right side of that graph. And although there were only 13 people, we saw some very interesting relationships. And one of them is that, yes, Fugl-Meyer and in that subgroup, I'm sorry, Fugl-Meyer and non-use did not correlate. However, we saw interesting correlations between confidence and non-use and total VR-LAT score and non-use. And when I didn't show it here for lack of time, but when we did a multiple regression, as some of you might guess, actually the VR-LAT total score was the strongest and only independent predictor of non-use above and beyond Fugl-Meyer. So this suggested to us that this attentional capacity might be a factor that is an important one in determining non-use. But this was not an experimental study. This was a study using a naturalistic assessment measure, a correlational study. And in the next, so let me, first, before I show you the next experiment, let me walk you through this updated model of non-use, which has an important additional component. And so the important additional component here is that not only do stroke patients have sensory motor deficits after stroke, but they also, many of them, have deficits in sustained attention and effort, ability to expend effort and arousal. So we know that this has also been called sort of cognitive capacity, attention capacity. There are a lot of similar and partially overlapping concepts in the literature. But when you have a problem with this sort of lowered effort, this may play an important role in this pattern that we see here, which is that high effort motor attempts this is similar to what was in the prior model, are punished, leading to reduced use. And this light gray arrow suggests a feedback loop that is increasingly reduced use of that arm. At the same time, you get a lower effort, lower effort to use the ipsilesional limb and you're rewarded more for using that limb, leading to further use of that limb, and you get this this positive feedback loop here, and this reinforces the maladaptive pattern and maladaptive neuroplasticity. Okay, so the model is quite similar, I admit, but it does really highlight this role of sustained attention and effort. Interestingly, in a prior study with neurotypical subjects, there was a direct assessment, a experimental assessment of the role of cognitive load on limb choice. And so this was a work by one of our friends, Bob Sainberg at Penn State, and his collaborators. And there were two conditions that they studied, a low and a high cognitive effort condition. In the low effort condition, people had to reach to objects in an array that were very different from one another. So they were drawn from very different categories, where like tools and clothing and animals. In the high effort condition, the objects were all drawn from the same category, semantic category. So say all clothing, items of clothing, and subjects had to reach out, and this was done in a horizontal dimension, reach out and reach to one of these targets, and which arm they used was measured. These are neurotypical controls. And I'm sorry. And what I want you to focus on is these the columns 2 and 3, which really show an interesting change in the low and the high effort condition. So column 2 in the low effort condition, gray is the left hand and black is the right hand. And the right hand is dominant. And so column 2 is on the left, and they're reaching across with some trials, they're reaching across with the right hand into the left, the dominant hand onto the left side. With the high, let's focus on column 2 over here in the high cognitive effort condition. Look at how much more they are reaching across into the left with the right hand. It's more black here than it is here. Does everyone nod if you're getting what I'm saying? Okay, great. So what this is a signal of is decreased efficiency. So what you want to do in an efficient reach, you want to reach with the hand closest to the object. And you can tell from columns 1 and 4 that that's pretty much what people do. But when under high load, they become less efficient and cross the midline more. So there's evidence that cognitive load increases motor activity, which was an important finding. And so now, finally, I'm going to tell you about what we wanted to do. We developed a very similar task, but with an couple of additional interesting components. We want to measure this in stroke patients and not just neurotypicals. We used virtual reality with a 3-dimensional appearing display. So it feels very immersive and you feel like you're really in the display. And we added another level of dual load. So in the basic condition, we have an array in which objects are drawn from different categories, and subjects are told on each trial to reach to a given object. They are actually pre-tested to make sure they know what the objects are and can comprehend the names of the objects. They also, as a cue on each trial, they see a black and white drawing of a different exemplar of that object. So they were really sure they know what they're supposed to reach for. In both the hard and the dual condition, the array of the objects are drawn from the same category. So here, all fruit. And the dual task condition has an additional component, which is that people have to respond when they hear a high tone and not a low tone. So they have a high, they hear a tone that's high or a tone that's low, and they just have to make any sound, or hi, or whatever they want to say. They just have to denote when they hear a high tone and not when they hear a low tone. So there's a bit of there's a go, no-go task superimposed on the reaching demand. So we're really looking at whether load changes the pattern of use of the affected limb. And now we're turning it over to Cory. So I will stop sharing.
All right.
And hopefully you'll have better luck than I did.
We'll see. We will see. Maybe not.
Could I ask a question, Laurel, while we're
Yeah.
getting this? Just does the total errors on the lateralized attention test, how is that related to the lateralized errors? I'm just wondering, are most of the errors committed on the left by right hemisphere stroke patients, or it's not like that?
Yeah, most errors are, there's still an asymmetry for most of the right CVA. So they are correlated to some degree. I don't remember the exact relationship. So, neglect gets more severe as people overall get less. But there also are, what we use is an index score of disparity between left and right, taking into account the total overall. So we want to know if there's neglect over and above the non-lateralized attention.
But you're pretty clear that it's the general that's predictive here, not the lateralized.
And well, the lateralized index score was not predictive.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, yeah,
Thanks.
yeah.
Okay, can you guys see this?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're good. Can you also see my cursor?
Yeah.
Okay, we're ready for anything. Okay, so in terms of the participants in this study, we had 12 individuals with stroke. There was 7 left CVA, 5 RCVA. The target sample for RCVA is 7. So we're still in the process of data collection. And let me just give the caveat right now that anything that I talk about today is preliminary. So these are sort of hot off the press, fresh results. 5 females, mean age 60.1, 10 age matched neurotypical controls, 8 females, the mean age was 68.4 years. Let me go pretty quickly through the inclusion criteria. So greater than or equal to 6 months post-stroke and first stroke, unilateral first ischemic or hemorrhagic anterior circulation stroke. We wanted the participants to be right-handed pre-stroke. For controls, we wanted them to be currently right-handed as well, and you'll see that that comes into play later. Western aphasia battery score of 4 or more, ability to provide consent, ability to follow instructions, also the ability to reach forward in front of the body for at least 70% of the total arm length, and no pain or musculoskeletal problems in the paretic arm and hand. I'm actually going to skip over the inclusion criteria for controls just for the sake of time. And just stop me if you have any questions as I go through this, please. Okay, so this is showing you what a trial sequence would look like within the virtual reality task. So now the person has the virtual reality headset on. They're holding motion trackers in either hand that allow them to move these gloves around that you see on the display, okay? So at the start of each trial, the participant would begin with an empty shelf, and there would be 2 neutral zones, one corresponding to the left hand and one corresponding to the right hand, or rather the cursors that they would see indicating the position of the left and right hands. So they would start with their hands in the neutral zone. A fixation cross would appear. After a bit of time, as long as they kept their hands in the neutral zone, a target cue would appear. And in this case, the target cue is a piano, okay? And then they went back to the fixation. They still had to keep their hands within the neutral zones. If they left at any point in time, this entire sequence would start over again. And then finally, they would see the target array. So the target array that you're seeing here would correspond to the basic condition. The reason for that is because you're seeing a mix of like vehicles and household objects, okay? So if it were the hard condition instead, it would all be from the same category. So maybe all of it would be household objects instead. So the piano is right here. And the participant at this point could reach out using the hand of their choice, either right or left, to contact the target item. Then it would disappear. They would see the empty shelf again, return their hands to the neutral positions, and the trial would start over again. Okay? Or they would progress to the next trial. Do you guys have any questions about the trial sequence? Okay. So there were 48 trials per block. There were 8 experimental blocks in total. So the primary predictions are all going to be in terms of arm use, although we are interested in some other variables. So for controls, what we're expecting is just a replication of what we saw in the work from Bob Sainberg and colleagues. So we're expecting that there would be decreased non-dominant or left arm use for the high effort task conditions, okay? It kind of helps me if I think about this in terms of like defaulting to a preferred option. So as things become more difficult, as your attention is absorbed in other components of the task, the controls will be more likely to default to the use of the dominant right arm. So we're expecting that there will be more of these inefficient reaches across the body midline with the dominant arm into the opposite side workspace. For participants with stroke, we're predicting essentially the same thing, but now in terms of the paretic arm use rather than the non-dominant arm use. So we're expecting that as task demands increase, they will show decreased paretic arm use and also more frequent cross midline reaches into the opposite side workspace with the non-paretic arm. In secondary analyses, which I won't be talking about today, we're also going to examine measures of performance and individual differences. Okay, any questions about the predictions? If any come up, let me know. So this is kind of like a quality control check, just to see whether, let me also say I'm just focusing on the basic and the dual condition. So there was also the hard condition where there was no secondary task. There was no tone that they also had to respond to at the same time. But the target array was the same as what it was in the dual task condition, where everything is drawn from the same category. So for all three groups, the dual task condition is it's taking a bit longer for them to initiate a reach. So what you're looking at more specifically is the duration between when they saw the onset of the target array and when one of the two hands left its neutral position. So for controls, the dual task condition is taking a bit longer than the basic condition. The RCVA group looks pretty similar to controls. And then there is this interesting pattern where the LCVA group is showing a larger discrepancy between those two conditions than the other groups. And so one possibility is that this could be rooted in the linguistic demands of the secondary task. So they are making some kind of utterance when they hear the high tone as compared to the low tone. So it could be that the LCVA group, due to linguistic deficits, is showing kind of a greater impairment. But the big take-home message from this is just that the secondary task worked in the sense that it's creating higher demand compared to the basic condition. Okay, I want to show you this for a few reasons. So this is showing arm use, but it's showing each of these plots is one participant. So this is the proportion of arm use for the paretic and the non-paretic arm. The green line is the basic condition. The blue line is the dual condition. Okay. So what we would expect is that there should be greater non-paretic use overall than paretic use. And really this is just to check that the slopes are going in the expected direction. So here we can see a person who is showing what we would expect. So the non-paretic use is greater than the paretic use. And you can also see, if you look at the lines for the dual compared to the basic condition, there's a little bit of an increase in use of the non-paretic arm for the dual task condition. So this is consistent with what we would expect. Here's a person who's showing that pattern a little bit more drastically, or a little bit more dramatically than the other participant that I was showing. So, and again, here's another person who's showing that pattern where the use of the non-paretic arm is increasing as task demands increase. So they're sort of, again, defaulting to use of the preferred arm. So I'm singling out this individual not because there was any issue with performance, but because the slope is going in the opposite direction of what we would expect. And this is actually a person who prefers to use the paretic arm during these tasks because they kind of see it as an opportunity to exercise that arm. So I'm going to take this person out of the graphs that you're going to be seeing next, just because it's a little bit, it's contradictory to what our expectations would be for arm use.
I'm just laughing because we don't want to take them out for that reason, but we'll come back to that issue. Yeah. You don't want to take out data for somebody who looks different than you predicted. because
Right.
it's sort of cherry picking, but we'll come back to that. Okay.
Okay. So let me preface how I'm going to be talking about this. And actually, the work that you saw from Bob Sainberg and colleagues was already set up in pretty much the same way. So you should be prepped to look at these plots. Okay, so this is the target array. I'm dividing this into the left and the right side, but I'm not describing it in terms of left and right side. I'll be describing it in terms of the non-dominant and the dominant side for controls, or the non-paretic and paretic side for participants with stroke. Okay, so if, for example, we were looking at the LCVA group, this would correspond to the non-paretic arm, right? The left side would correspond to the left non-paretic arm. The right side would correspond to the paretic arm. Okay. And so now these are the results, and this is arm choice by target side, which is really what we're interested in. So let's start with controls, and let's look at just the pattern overall. So this is the non-dominant left side. This is the dominant right side. And what these plots are showing you is the proportion of non-dominant arm use in this yellowish color, dominant arm use in this greenish color, okay? So let's just look at kind of, again, the pattern overall. Participants are using the non-dominant arm more frequently for the non-dominant left side. So for the corresponding side, they're using the dominant right arm overall for the dominant right side. So in terms of efficiency, this makes sense, okay? Just kind of taking stock of the pattern overall. But what we're most interested in is the discrepancy between the green area on the non-dominant side comparing the basic and the dual task condition. So you can see that there is this growing green area if you compare the two, or a decreasing yellow area, to put it in the opposite way. What that's indicating is that these individuals are crossing over the midline with the dominant right arm into the opposite side workspace more frequently during the dual task condition compared to the basic condition. So this is in line with their predictions. Essentially, as task demands are increasing, as attention is absorbed elsewhere, they're defaulting to use of the right arm, even if to use it would mean crossing the midline, doing this kind of inefficient reach. Okay, so this is the LCVA group. Now the non-paretic side is the left side, the paretic side is the right side. And these colors are indicating, so yellow is use of the paretic arm and green is use of the non-paretic arm. Let's just first kind of look at the pattern overall as compared to controls. And so what you can see is that, yes, there is more non-paretic left arm use on the non-paretic side. However, if we look over on the paretic side, they're crossing over a lot more with the non-paretic arm than controls are. So there is more kind of crossing over, this inefficient reaching pattern overall as compared to controls. The thing that we're primarily interested in, though, is this, again, increasing green area, decreasing yellow area. That's indicating that for the dual compared to the basic condition, they're crossing over more frequently with the non-paretic arm, even though, it's inefficient to do so. It requires crossing across the midline. So for RCVA, the results look similar, although you kind of need to mentally flip these around. So the paretic side is now on the left. The non-paretic side is on the right. For the most part, they're using the right arm for the right, the left arm for the left. But we do see, again, for the dual compared to the basic condition, increasing use of the non-paretic arm, even though it's requiring them to cross over the midline. Okay, so just to give you an interim summary before I pass it over to Shailesh. So with increased task demand, there's decreased paretic arm for individuals with stroke and non-dominant arm for control use. And there's additional evidence of decreased efficiency of arm choice, meaning the cross midline reaches. The secondary task and dual task condition increased reaction time. So this is confirmatory evidence that the dual task condition with the secondary component responding to the tone is more difficult than the basic condition. And then also a possible interaction emerging with hemisphere of lesion, where the LCVA group looked a little more affected. And in future analyses, we'll examine correlations between paretic arm use and some background measures of interest to really look at individual differences in non-use. Okay. Any questions with anything that I've talked about so far? If not, I'll pass it over to Shailesh. All right, thanks.
Can you see my slide? All right. So thank you, Laurel and Cory, for presenting how use capacity disparity has been studied in our project. In the next part, I will present some very preliminary data on the measurement of arm use in patients' daily life outside the laboratory and some potential neurophysiologic correlates of arm use. Now, as Cory said, he prefaced it saying that the data that he presented was preliminary, and this makes this part really pre-preliminary. So I have even fewer patients. So just a disclaimer that these are emerging trends. The work that I'm presenting has been possible because of hard work of my research assistant, Josh Jacob. He coordinated everything from patient recruitment and, importantly, my schedule for data collection and processing of accelerometer as well as TMS data. So thank you, Josh. Now, there have been multiple ways in which clinicians and scientists have been trying to capture this arm use after stroke. As you saw, the actual use of the arm test and the virtual reality-based assessments of arm use. These are more apt for quantifying the disparity between the arm use and their capacity. And these are conducted in a very structured environment and provide objective measures of this use capacity disparity. But if you think about the world outside the lab, it is quite variable and it is unique to each individual. And so the measures of arm use outside the laboratory are needed. And there are two main ways in which we measure this. One is using patient reports and accelerometry. And these two really measure either the arm use or the perception of arm use of the patients, or rather patient's perception of arm use. So let's first talk about these patient reports. These are these index patients' perception of their arm use in daily life. And an example of that is the motor activity log, which is a semi-structured interview that is administered to determine how much, so the amount of use, how much they use their arm, and how successfully they use their arm. So that's the quality of movement scale. And these two are graded on a 6-point ordinal scale where patient scores their amount and quality of use while performing different tasks such as opening a doorknob or brushing, putting on socks, etc. Now, a study that compared the accuracy between or consistency between the self-reported performance and sensor-based measures of the paretic arm. So what you're seeing here is that on the x-axis is the difference between self-report and accelerometry data. And on the y-axis is the number of participants in a study that measured both. And so what you see is if they are accurate, the measures would be, these are the participants who were who were pretty consistent between the self-report and accelerometry data, while a large proportion of participants actually underreported their use of the paretic arm. So the second measure that is thought to be the gold standard, but it's really, we don't know if it is the use of accelerometers. So accelerometers are essentially commercially available devices that look like these large wristwatches, and that these can be worn throughout the day. And what they measure is they measure acceleration in either gravitational units or activity count, which is an arbitrary unit that the manufacturer has specified. And these data can really quantify how the limbs are, how the two arms are engaged to perform activities when the patients are in their home and communities. So in an ongoing pilot study, which is also part of the the VR study, there are two other aims. And the second aim is to determine the relationship between arm choice in the virtual reality test that was described before. And if that arm choice in that virtual reality test relates to real world arm use using accelerometers. So far we have data from 6 individuals with stroke and 2 controls. And this is, as I said, a subset of the VR study. Participants who wear 2 accelerometers, one on each wrist, and they are sent home. They're asked to wear these accelerometers, the specified accelerometers on each hand. They receive daily morning reminders to dawn on the devices and keep them throughout the night if possible, if they're comfortable. If not, then they're asked to remove them. And this data is collected for 7 consecutive days. Now, there are multiple metrics that we can calculate, but since this project is in the preliminary phase, I'm just going to share some qualitative data and some very little quantitative data. So what we do is we first calculate the number of hours of the use of each limb by summing all the seconds during recording phase when the activity count is not 0, so which means the 2 limbs are moving. And then we calculate a use ratio that quantifies the total duration of the paretic arm relative to the non-paretic arm. So values at 1 would indicate that the 2 limbs are used for equal durations, while if it is 0, then that would mean that paretic limb was not used at all. We also quantify, so that is the amount of use, if you will. And then we also quantify the magnitude ratio, which quantifies the contribution in terms of the magnitude of acceleration of each limb. We also plot these density plots as shown here, where on the x-axis it indicates the contribution of each limb to the activity, and the y-axis shows you the magnitude of movement. And this color represents the frequency with which the cold colors essentially indicate lower frequencies, while the warm colors indicate higher frequencies. So what I'm showing you here is the use ratio, which is the total duration of the paretic arm activity with relation to the non-paretic arm. And these black bars represent 2 controls, and their values represent the duration of the non-dominant with respect to the dominant arm. And so what you can see here is the non-dominant arm is used around 85 to 90% of the dominant arm, the duration. And these red bars demonstrate data from patients with LCVA, and the blue bars show the data from patients with RCVA. Now, as you can see, most stroke patients, most patients with stroke use their paretic arm quite less compared to their non-paretic arm, anywhere between 50 to 70%. And we do have an exception here, where this one patient with LCVA, he uses his paretic arm, paretic right arm, more than his non-paretic left arm. What I'm showing you here is, I'm only showing you individual data because we don't have enough data to kind of run statistics. But here I'm showing you the density plots. On the left-hand side, we have patients with LCVA, and on the right-hand side, we have patients with RCVA. And these numbers in the right-hand corners indicate their Fugl-Meyer scores. Now here, the participant with almost normal Fugl-Meyer score, 65, and paretic dominant arm seems very similar to patients with, to controls, where both upper extremities are active throughout the day, and they use relatively similar magnitudes. For those with moderate paresis, like this one and this one, here, what we see is we see low peaks. Essentially, if you look at these scales are not uniform. So the magnitude of these accelerations are low, which means that those with low Fugl-Meyers have movements with lower amplitudes bilaterally, and that the upper extremity activity is more asymmetric with lower contributions of the paretic arm compared to the non-paretic arm. Now, again, this is 5 participants, and it really does not make allow us to make any conclusions about the level of impairment and arm use. While accelerometry is a good way to provide some data, there is considerable variability in the data across days. And this is one of our patients with right hemisphere damage and his data over 6 days. And as you can see, his activity was asymmetric for 5 out of 6 days, while for one of those days, it was quite low and symmetric. Also on other days where the activity was asymmetric, there also seemed to be considerable differences in the magnitude of movements. And so we are currently working on establishing really objective ways to determine the reliability of this data, as well as make informed consents about which of these should be considered and which should be, which is an outlier. Importantly, it also raises questions about what exactly do these graphs represent? What activities do these graphs represent? And I think we don't have an answer to that. So probably combining this accelerometry with methods such as ecological momentary assessment might provide us more details. Coming back to our original question, do the measures of arm choice in VR relate to accelerometry data? And again, this is just 6 patients, so take it with a bowl of salt, not a pinch. And what I'm showing you here, the bottom line is that current preliminary data do not suggest that there is a relationship. So for example, if we compare this participant with this participant, their paretic arm usage in basic condition of the VR task was pretty disparate, but their use ratios are pretty similar. So again, we do not know what first of all, this is preliminary, but the way I have been thinking about this is that these both tests are measuring very different things. So for example, VR is measuring arm choice in a very constrained task, in a 20-minute lab-based task, where we are measuring the effect of attentional load on arm choice, while accelerometry is measuring arm use across 5 days, where patients might be doing different things in different contexts. And so these might be measuring different things, and we don't know. So as we get more data, we'll keep you posted. Here I want to quickly jump to a different topic, which I think is quite interesting. And here I will discuss a potential neurophysiologic correlate of arm use in stroke. So big picture, we know that motor cortex has a representation of different muscles that in awake humans can be mapped using transcranial magnetic stimulation. So essentially what we do is we use TMS over a grid that is placed on the motor cortex, and we apply 6 to 8 pulses of TMS at a supra-threshold intensity on a 10 by 10 grid, and we record MEP amplitudes at each spot. Now, using those MEP amplitudes, then we can reconstruct a map or a sort of a representation of that particular muscle in the motor cortex. Typically, what we find is in healthy controls, this representation expands over area over the motor cortex and is multi-peaked. We also know that this is true for the dominant and dominant hemispheres in neurotypical controls. And we also know that both hemispheres reorganize after stroke. And so what we did in this study was we mapped the ipsilesional and contralesional hemispheres. What do these maps represent? We think they represent the amount of use, because following immobilization, there was reduction in map areas in neurotypical controls. And here is a study that has shown that changes in bilateral map areas was related to motor activity log in like 4 or 5 patients. So our prediction was that the characteristics of maps, either the map area or number of peaks, will predict parectic arm use in real world life. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is 4 representative participants with stroke, 2 of them and we've collected 5 so far, so I'm showing you 4. The 2 on the top have significantly asymmetric arm performance. That is greatly reduced use of the paretic arm compared to the non-paretic arm. And if the ones on the bottom do represent some asymmetry, but it's not as profound as the ones on the top. And now if we look at the motor cortical representations of these participants, so as you can see here, the motor cortical representations in these patients is also highly asymmetric. But if you compare that with those patients who do have, who are relatively less asymmetric, or rather more symmetric, you see a more symmetric representation of the motor cortex. So again, with these 4 subjects, this is not clearly conclusive, but quite encouraging, and makes me think more about what these maps might represent, and could these be a potential target to promote arm use after stroke. So these are preliminary findings. Accelerometers can be used to capture arm activity outside the lab or the clinic, and they provide a quantitative measure into some measures of participation. We need some more work about reliability and meaningfulness of these data. And motor cortical maps may provide some neurophysiological insights into mechanisms of arm use. Some future questions that we have are, again, as Cory and Laurel indicated, we are looking at what aspects would predict arm use. How can we use this? How can we measure this arm use disparity or use capacity disparity? And how does that relate to activities outside the lab? And finally, what are some of the neuroanatomic and neurophysiologic correlates of arm use? Questions? I'm sorry, we just have 5 minutes for questions. We didn't plan that way, but John.
Very interesting, all 3 of you. And I was thinking as you were presenting the accelerometry and the virtual reality comparison, you know, in some ways it's not at all surprising, because the virtual reality task requires only one limb, and there's no advantage to using both hands. But so many tasks that we engage in during the day demand some amount of use of both limbs, and then, you know, what strategies do you have if the limb doesn't work well? So I mean, it's just not surprising that there's a lot more messiness in the accelerometry. But the question that I wanted to ask is about whether, if I understand it correctly, you only consider handedness in neurotypical patients, and you consider site of lesion in stroke patients, and especially at milder levels of impairment. Would we not expect some handedness carryover, and then does that add another complication for how to analyze the data?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'll answer that. So that notion is called concordance in the literature, the concordance of the side of weakness and the side of and the handedness. And so certainly, I think that is a big factor that we haven't explored adequately in our data. You know, all of our subjects are right-handed. So the left CVA, even though they might be hemiparetic or weaker on that side, that's their dominant side. So, you know, so how does that impact? We would expect, if anything, that you'd see a stronger non-use in the right CVA, because that's their non-dominant side is the weak side. So really, what motivation do they have to use that side? So yes, very good. In a bigger,
and I guess also, I mean, since we know that handedness isn't truly binary, but there's a continuum. I mean, maybe even
right.
the degree of handedness would
exactly.
Moderate.
And to the degree that you can trust the Edinburgh handedness inventory, we do have those data, and we will be looking at that as well as in a continuous manner. Yeah, I think Amanda and Aaron. Amanda?
Sure. So I had 2 questions. One, it's not unrelated to the first part of John's comment. One thing I was wondering about the sort of trying to relate your virtual reality task with the accelerometry data is that to me, there's probably a fairly large discrepancy in one motion in particular, which is shoulder abduction. Your virtual reality task, I imagine, is mostly sort of flexion extension at the shoulder rather than abduction. And most sort of daily tasks require kind of anti-gravity activation, which is primarily through kind of abduction at the deltoids. So I wondered about that. It also made me, I was wondering about your thoughts on, the scatter plot you showed at the beginning with the Fugel-Meyer score, the upper extremity score with non-use, and sort of not unrelated to this idea of shoulder abduction ability. Are there specific components or sections of the Fugel-Meyer that maybe do a better job of predicting? So if they show kind of medial deltoid problems, I don't know if there's any.
That's a great suggestion, Amanda. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Shailesh. Yeah, please do.
So you're right. You're right with shoulder abduction being one of the key components that is missing in patients with stroke. That could be one of the factors. In fact, there is some very recent work that has shown, this is only related to the accelerometry data, that patients with more compensatory behaviors are the ones who show lesser arm use, and that is those compensations are not captured by Fugel-Meyer. As much as we think Fugel-Meyer is a good scale, those compensations are really not captured by Fugel-Meyer.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. My second question was.
Oh, okay. Go
sorry,
ahead. It's 1 o'clock. I just want to make sure people who please stay if you can, but if you need to leave, we won't be insulted. Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, my second question was related to the heat maps with the sensory motor representation sensory motor cortex. And I was wondering about your thoughts on, how much of that is kind of, to me, it strikes me as a little bit chicken or the egg. We know that sensory motor cortex representation is sort of highly plastic, and how, is there any relationship with the chronicity of the stroke or the length of non-use that maybe also predicts asymmetries in representation across the two cortices?
So great question. First of all, I don't have data to, my data doesn't, we don't have enough data to say whether it is chronicity. I think of these sensory motor maps, the cortical maps, as more of it's not a stroke specific deficit. I think of more of that difference between the paretic and non-paretic side, or the changes in the paretic side, as more of a motor, something that is related to the flexibility of movement that you see in, and you see that the reason why I'm saying that this is not only related to stroke is because we see this constriction of map and reduction to one peak in patients with pain, in patients with,
That's what I mean. I wonder if it's,
yes.
You don't know if it's a function of the fact that they're not using it, and so the cortex kind of
So it again is a
reorganizes.
chicken or egg problem. But
Yeah.
I think
That's the same exact problem. I've raised that too, Shailesh, right? Yeah.
But
that's a concern.
One way to deal with it is to match the, when you're looking at asymmetries, is to match the patients with Fugel-Meyer, by the impairment level, because the map could, just to disentangle the direct relationship between map and Fugel-Meyer.
True, but and we see that those two maps which I showed you, I don't know if I can, but the two maps that I was showing you were not from very similar sort of Fugel-Meyers were.
But we know that you showed in the beginning that Fugel-Meyer doesn't predict non-use. So I'm just wondering if it's,
even here. So for example, this guy right here is 43 Fugel-Meyer, and this guy right here is 44 Fugel-Meyer. So if we look at the cortical map size, they are very different. So it may not be just explained by Fugel-Meyer. At least, I mean, again, this is.
No, I guess I'm wondering, do you think, I guess, what are your thoughts on the causality here? So do you think that it's the change in sensory motor representation that's sort of leading to the non-use, or do you think it's the other way around, or is it more messy than either of those options? Most likely it's
one is, I mean, I think it's more messy than either of those options, but I would think that this is more related to the limited movement repertoire that these patients have, and they move in those small repertoires that lead to these constricted maps. But again, that's open to investigation.
Yeah, that's a hard one.
That's a very interesting one, I think. Aaron.
Thanks. That was a really interesting talk. Just a quick follow-up comment to the discussion you were just having, and then I do have a separate question. My quick comment was just that it may also depend, this sort of issue between mapping or the issue about these maps could also depend in part on exactly where the stroke is affecting, because if the stroke is cutting off the corticospinal tract, then it's going to affect the map, even though the sort of representation in cortex may not be different.
For sure, for sure.
And I guess my question was, coming back to this accelerometer data again, I was just wondering if you have a way of sort of disentangling whether what you're measuring is actually arm movements versus like whole body motion, like when walking, just because your accelerometers are probably going to pick up everything, even if the arm isn't swinging.
That is a very good question, and my answer is no. At this point, no, because these are commercially available units, and what we are using is really activity counts. To be able to do that, we would have to have two capacity. I mean, we will have to have we'll have to have accelerometers that can give us raw accelerometer data, and then I think people are doing this work somewhere where they're looking at basic activities of daily living in the lab, and then having people use that at home and using machine learning, really identifying what activities are these people doing at home. And we're not in a position to do that. So I agree that this is a very crude measure of arm activity. What at best what it gives us is a disparity or a asymmetry between the paretic and epigenetic side.
And one of the suggestions I had as Shailesh and I were chatting is that it may be that a quasi-naturalistic task in the home, assigned tasks during which we measure accelerometry, like some kitchen tasks, like assuming that everyone does some degree of at least making coffee or something, that we can at least keep them in a comparable environment. And there are even, we can talk about that.
You could also have them wear more than one sensor.
Yeah.
And then you can cross-correlate. Like if it's a whole body, you can wear one of the ones that goes on the chest or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest. And the other thing you could possibly think about doing is removing the band of frequencies that corresponds to something like walking.
Yep.
Thanks.
Masa?
Hey, thank you for the great presentation. I just had a quick question for the part that Cory presented. So, Cory, you were talking about like the moving the arm across. And the other side is like a less energy efficient, right? Like, have you measured, or do you know? I don't know anything about this, like even though technically speaking, crossing is more, not kind of energy cost effective, but like metabolically speaking, if you have lesion in the one side, does it take more energy?
Yeah, I
so
don't know.
If you measure that, and physiologically speaking, can you say that the energy efficiency balance? So I just had that thought.
I really don't know. I mean, it's an excellent question. And I was even thinking about this morning and wondering whether the time that it takes to reach might be roughly the same as, so like even without getting into metabolic components, is it possible that crossing over with the non-dominant arm is actually more efficient for some people in the sense that it can be accomplished, or it can accomplish a task of interest more quickly than using the dominant arm? So
that's a good,
yeah,
that might be good.
Like there are different
Or
ways of defining.
maybe acceleration or jerk, because it's a component of force, right?
Hmm.
So I think, yeah, it may be better measure. I don't know.
We also are going to be looking at reach curvature too as a measure of both motor, sort of skill, and that could also serve as a measure where we would predict that the first of all that the paretic arm is going to have less direct movements than the non-paretic arm, and perhaps that could be related to the tendency to cross over the midline, the disparity between the curvature. So I think you're right there. We can dig into these data a lot more.
All right, guys, I have to go to another meeting.
All right, yeah.
I will
Great. I'm glad everyone's so interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your questions. All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.